This is the exact date that house prices will be their lowest, and you'll kick yourself if you get the timing wrong because you don't want to look back in 3 years and think, I missed the boat. Now, after studying the housing market for 7 years, I've learned that all economists almost always get their forecasts wrong, but it's worth having a go anyway, because by trying to answer this question, you still learn what drives house prices up and down, and that makes you both a better property investor and a better property owner. So I'll start by looking at the 4 factors that show you how affordable houses really are. And once we've seen how those numbers are changing, we'll finally be able to say when house prices could be at their lowest. Now, New Zealand has just gone through the biggest house price downturn it has ever had. House prices peaked in November 2021, and then they dropped almost 18%. Now, that is more than during the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis, and even during the first parts of the recent COVID-19 pandemic. I mean, if you bought a house at the top of the market for $800,000, it might have fallen in value by over $140,000. And in fact, if you bought the same house in parts of Wellington, it's even worse because house prices there went down 30% in some parts. Now, that's like saving up a $200,000 deposit, buying a house for $1 million, and then 4 years later, not only having that $200K deposit completely wiped out, but you'd still be underwater because your mortgage would still be $100,000 more than the value of your house. That is just how bad the recent property market downturn really was. And almost every property statistic, it got about as bad as it's ever been. I mean, the number of properties sold per capita, lowest ever. Interest rates, well, they spiked, so property investors' cash flow, that was pretty much the lowest ever as well. In fact, there were way more houses left unsold on property listing websites like OneRoof, TradeMe, and realestate.co.nz, and that's all just to say that homeowners and property investors, they were hurting. But then it seemed like there was finally a light at the end of the tunnel, because after 18 months of house prices falling, they appeared to bottom out in May 2023. And since then, property prices have basically gone sideways, up maybe 1% or 2%, depending on which data set you look at. But what if that bottom of the market, what if May 2023 wasn't really the bottom of the market? What if that isn't the point where house prices were actually at their lowest? And what if properties got more affordable, even if the price of the house went up 1% or 2%? I know that sounds a bit weird, but that's actually what's happened, because real housing affordability isn't just about the price you write on the contract when you buy a house. It's about these 4 factors: how much houses cost compared to the cost of living, how much houses cost compared to your income, the interest rate you have to pay, and how willing the bank is to lend you money in the first place. And by all of those 4 measures, properties got more affordable since May 2023 when house prices technically bottomed out. But how does that actually work? Well, if your income and the cost of living is going up while house prices are basically staying the same, well, those properties are becoming more affordable compared to everything else. And so what us economists will often do is adjust house prices for either inflation or for incomes. And once you do that, you will see that inflation-adjusted house prices, or what we call real house prices, have actually continued to go down over the last few years, even while the price that you see online has stabilized. If we use the Reserve Bank's official numbers, houses are actually 6.7% cheaper today than the technical bottom of the market over 2 years ago. And this might surprise you, but once you adjust for incomes, house prices are actually 7% cheaper today than before the COVID-19 pandemic even started and house prices shot up. And the reason behind that is that while house prices are up 24% since the end of 2019, incomes are up 33%. And that is the exact reason why a record share of properties are currently being bought by first home buyers. They are now the biggest group in the market, even in some of our most expensive cities. And even though house prices have skyrocketed since 2005, we see a greater share of properties being bought by first home buyers today than 20 years ago. And part of the reason for this is that interest rates have fallen massively over the last couple of years, and that also makes housing even more affordable. I mean, back in May 2023, again, the bottom of the market, the average one-year interest rate that you'd pay on your mortgage was 6.7%. Today, it's 4.6%. So let's say you bought this house for $800,000 with a 20% deposit. Well, you'd pay about $42,000 in interest per year at the technical bottom of the market, whereas if you bought that same house today for the same amount of money, you'd save about $13,000 a year in interest because you're only paying 29 grand in interest a year to the bank because now interest rates are lower. So when first home buyers are doing their sums to figure out whether they should rent or take out a mortgage to buy a home, more of them are deciding to buy today. But it's not only the interest rate that you pay that makes housing more affordable, because we've also got to think about how the bank decides whether to give you a mortgage or not, because they don't use the interest rate you pay. They use what's called a servicing test rate. So even though, take out a mortgage today, you might pay an interest rate of 4.5, 4.6%. Well, they're actually going to test you on whether you could afford that mortgage if the interest rate was closer to 6.7% or perhaps up to 7%. I mean, back when interest rates were much higher over 2 years ago, most banks were testing your mortgage at around 9%, which meant you couldn't afford to borrow as much money to go and buy a house. But now that interest rates have fallen, even if you didn't get a pay rise over the last 2-3 years, you could potentially afford a much bigger mortgage today. So let's put some numbers around that. Let's say 2 years ago, you could afford a mortgage of $500K. That's what the bank was willing to lend you. Today, you might be able to get a mortgage of $620,000 just simply because interest rates have fallen. So although house prices might be 1% higher than they were 2.5 years ago, depending on which data you look at, you might be able to borrow almost 25% more and afford a much more valuable house. And that's the reason why houses feel significantly more affordable today compared to the technical bottom of the market. And that's my point. You don't just want to think about when the price you pay is its lowest, but also when it's going to feel the most affordable and when they feel like they're lowest. But if house prices have gotten cheaper, at least in real terms over the last few years, where could they go in their future and when will they be the most affordable? And just before we get to that, if you're learning something from this video, do me a quick favor and hit the like button, because that's how I know if I should do more videos like this one or not. And honestly, it really helps with the YouTube algorithm. Subscribing, that helps too. And if you do click the button, you'll start to get recommended more videos like this. But if you already do subscribe, you'll know that the interest rate you pay on your mortgage, it's likely to go up in 2026, starting about mid-year. And so houses are likely to get more unaffordable or less affordable over the next 12 months, at least when we think about the interest rate you pay. If we think about the servicing test rates and whether the banks are more or less willing to lend to you over the next 1, 2, 3 years, they likely won't change too much over the next 12 months. I'd expect them to continue to hover around that 7% mark. And the reason behind that is that banks are competing really fiercely at the moment. Most recently, they were doling out massive cashbacks. So if you took out a loan or a mortgage of $500,000, many banks would give you up to $7.5 grand in cash just to get you to take out that mortgage through them or switch your mortgage to them. But if interest rates are likely to go up a little bit, decreasing affordability, and the banks are probably not going to change their policies too much or their servicing test rates, what about house prices versus inflation? Because if the cost of living has been rising faster than house prices and the real value of houses is going down, at what point will they be at their absolute lowest? Well, the Reserve Bank expects house prices to pick up throughout the year, rising 3.8% by the end of 2026. ANZ says 5%. Some other banks are a little bit more aggressive, others a bit more conservative. But most economists are picking that house prices will rise a tad throughout 2026. While on the other hand, inflation's currently sitting at 3% and it's expected to fall to 2% over the next 12 months. So if interest rates have fallen and are expected to go up mid-2026, house prices, they're meant to pick up while inflation falls. Well, according to the Reserve Bank's official forecasts, we might be nearing the bottom of the market where houses feel they're most affordable. But just before I reveal the exact date that real house prices could be their lowest, one question many Kiwis might have right now is, well, is this really the bottom of the market? Is this really the end of the downturn? Or could it be possible that all the economists' forecasts are wrong and that house prices won't actually recover? Because at the end of 2024, almost all the banks were putting out forecasts similar to these, predicting that house prices would go up in 2025. And then it didn't happen. Having said that, there are some reasons to think that the current property price downturn could be nearing its end. If we look at previous downturns in 2008 with the GFC or the Asian financial crisis at the end of the 90s, two things stick out. First of all, historically, New Zealand property downturns from peak to recovery, they've averaged about 4.5 years. And if we look at the most recent cycle, property prices peaked in November 2021, and 4.5 years after that point would be around May 2026. On top of that, house price downturns tend to follow a W pattern. We see that house prices typically have an initial fall, then they start to go up ever so slightly, they fall again, and then they eventually recover. Effectively, it's a double dip downturn. That happened in 1997, 2008, and most recently in the aftermath of the COVID-19 property boom. And so because it's been almost 4.5 years since the downturn started, and we've gone through our double dip, it could be quite possible that house prices could recover in the next 12 months. But what's the exact date that it could happen? Well, to answer that, you need to understand that house prices, they are a little more predictable than you might think because they tend to follow a similar pattern throughout the year. So house prices are often soft and go down in December and January, while everyone is away for Christmas, and the people who do sell during that holiday period, well, maybe they're under a bit more pressure and are more likely to accept a slightly lower price just to get the property sold. Then you typically see a bounce back in February once all the buyers are back, and then generally property prices heat up in the warmer months, but they tend to be softer in late autumn, typically around May. And that is the reason that when you look at previous property downturns, many of the downturns happen in May and December because those are some of the worst months for property prices. And that's why if I had to narrow it down and pick the exact date when house prices could be at their lowest, it'll likely be in one of those 2 months, either December 2025 or May 2026. But if you forced me to pick, I'd give an honourable mention to May 2026 because that date is exactly 4.5 years after the market peaked and 3 years after the market bottomed out. But if I had to stake my money on it, I'd say December 2025 as the month that house prices will be at their lowest in real terms. Why do I think that? Well, if I look at how long booms, peaks, downturns and troughs typically last in a New Zealand property cycle, a boom might last for 6 to 8 years, a downturn for 18, 19 months, and that trough tends to last for about 2.5 years. And December 2025 is exactly 2.5 years after the technical bottom of the market. Even if we look at our central bank's official forecasts, December 2025 is the quarter where they expect inflation-adjusted house prices to be at their lowest. And if I had to pick an exact date, I'd go for a public holiday. So probably the 31st of December 2025. But do you agree with me? Let me know in the comments with your thoughts and then we can discuss down there. And make sure you watch this video where I share my 9-step blueprint to retire rich through property. Click here to watch it now.